Council, I'd like to call a special budget council meeting of April 5th, 2022 to order with adoption of the agenda, and I want to amend the agenda to add a conversation under 6D regarding communications position. So I'll make that motion. Councillor Palmer, Councillor Brooks Hill, all in favor? Motion's carried. Adoption of the minutes of the special budget council meeting of March 22nd. Someone want to make that motion? Councillor Chalette, seconded by Councillor Elliott. All in favor? Motion's carried. Any business arising from those minutes? Saying none, I'm going to go on right into 6A staff reports. Draft regarding financial plan regarding water rate increase. So, Ms. McCabe, any comments or presentation regarding that?
Yes, Your Worship. A moment. I just want to draw council's attention to a few things that have been done. And so at the meeting on the 15th of March, I believe, council asked staff to review, in particular, the water and sewer capital projects for any that could be potentially grant funded or funded from other sources. And so staff did finish the reviews of both of those plans. And we did identify a few changes. And so the capital plans have been updated and the changes are noted in the report. And then staff or council also asked for rate increase scenarios for both utilities. And so those have been provided as well as requested. So, yeah.
Okay. Any comments? We want to get the first motion on the table and then we can have a conversation about this. Councillor Brooks.
I'll do it. I'll just plug in some numbers and see.
And then we can talk?
Yeah.
All right.
That the long-term financial plan reflects an annual water rate increase of 5% and that staff prepare a bylaw to amend fees and charges bylaw 2256 to increase water rates by 10% for 2022.
Seconder for the motion. Councillor Palmer. All right. Now let's have a discussion on that. Councillor Brooks Hill, you brought it up. Let's talk about it.
Well, basically, looking at the numbers in front of us, it's, looking at 15 years is kind of difficult, but focusing on the short term, the 10% increase now will reflect larger increases later. So 10% this year, 5% later on. Seems like a good compromise for now. And obviously, the increases in future years are subject to council people, so just putting in 5% is a decent kind of benchmark.
Okay. So, Ms. McCabe, when I look at this rate and just want to kind of confirm, I thought I had the figures in front of me. What will that be total amount for 5% is an increase of about $25 over last year, and 10% about $49 over last year. But what would the total be this year for our residents, for residential water at that rate, total amount?
For a 5% tax or 5% water rate increase, that would bring the water rate for residential property up to $515 a year.
Okay, and 10% brings us up to?
That brings it to $539.
$539.
So the difference is $24 between the two, or $2 a month.
Okay, all right. Any comments from other councillors about that? How do you guys feel? Councillor Charlotte.
Thank you, Worship. From what I can see, that would be probably a minimal increase to be able to cover the recommended projects. I think, though, I agree with Councillor Brooks Hill that it's a step in the right direction, and hopefully that the candidates for the next election will have a strong look at what we need for our water system to continue flowing the way we've come to expect it, and can come in with a mandate to maintain at least that 5%, if not increase it further.
Okay, thank you for that. Any other comments from council?
Just a quick question. So the increase that we're proposing is the extra money that'll surpass our expenses will be put into the reserve. Is that what I understand?
Mr.
That is
McCabe? Yeah.
So looking at strategic thinking on financing, right now with inflation, you should be, if we can get money at a fixed rate, which we can through the municipal provider.
To borrow money.
Yeah, you can get it at a fixed rate. Now is the time to borrow, right? Any financial strategy, if you can get money at a fixed low rate, you borrow now when it's at 2% and the inflation rate's at 7%, right? So if we're thinking stashing away money now, that's not what you want to do. And so good financial management doesn't go this way. So I'm just, if we're putting money away when inflation's going up, we're not making the wisest choice.
Okay. So then you're suggesting, and I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, but what I'm hearing is you're suggesting for some of these capital projects, instead of us increasing the water rates to go into reserves, that we should be borrowing the money to do the projects.
I think at this time, when inflation is facing us, or stagflation for the next couple of years, if we can get money at 2%, we're mad to wait 5 years or I put the money away where we get 0% or whatever money we get out of it.
Okay, so I'm going to ask, under that, I'm going to ask Mr. McCabe some questions. So now you're the accountant, Ms. McCabe, so I'm going to be asking that. So when we talk about that, are we in the ballpark? Is Councillor Elliott in the ballpark as far as what we could borrow money from? And if so, can we go that route, but then how do we pay it back? Do we need to increase our water rates to be able to pay that back, or what we collect now, will that cover purchasing, doing borrowing?
To your worship, first, the current 10-year borrowing rate that's being projected by MFA for their spring borrowing, which is this spring, is 3.36%. The city wouldn't be able to borrow though until next spring, just because there's a timeline that has to be followed. There has to be alternate approval processes and quashing periods, et cetera, which stretch it out. So we actually wouldn't be able to make it for the fall borrowing right now, because we'd have to have that done by June. So we'd be actually borrowing next spring. So I can't predict what the rates are going to be like next spring. Probably higher. How much higher though? Unfortunately, I don't have a crystal ball. I wish I did. So borrowing can be beneficial when rates are lower, for sure, instead of saving. In the water capital plan in particular, there's not a lot of identified, like there's not the huge dollars being spent up in the earlier part of the plan as there is in, say, the sewer plan. And so the large money that we're planning to spend isn't out until 2026, 2027. And so preemptively borrowing now for projects that are multiple years out and may change might be problematic. It can be problematic. And so that's the challenge with the water fund. With the sewer fund, there's a little bit more definitely identifiable projects, such as the wastewater treatment plant, which we are doing a borrowing bylaw for. So that one's in there. And then obviously we have some very identifiable projects to be done in that particular fund for the next 5 years, according to the study that's being done. We're not quite at that point yet with the water fund. And so borrowing in advance for projects we're not quite sure of yet might not be as wise, in my view, as looking at that for the sewer plan.
So just how entrenched or put in cement are the reserves? If we borrow now for something that we're stashing away money for, if we use that or borrow to spend current on the project now, could we not transfer the reserve, reshuffle the reserve pile in the future? Is that within our realm?
Okay.
I think, through your worship, I think what you're asking is, can I borrow the money? Can the city borrow the funds now for the water utility? Can the water utility borrow the funds?
Any particular project that you're stashing away money on a reserve from, can we borrow and apply it now? Use borrowed money and transfer the reserves in the future?
We could transfer it to the reserves in the current year.
Yeah, or shuffle it around so it matches, so you'll have a big, say we need, some money for, I don't know what, roads, for instance, or a major road project. Borrow the money, and whatever money we have in the road reserve, put it into the water reserve.
No, unfortunately,
I mean, how much leeway do we have to play?
Go ahead,
So-
Mr. David, no, right?
through your worship, the water reserve and the sewer reserve and the Big Eddy water reserves are three independent pots of money that cannot be mixed or blended with any of the funds that are reserves that are within the general fund. And that's because you've got different people paying into those funds. So not everybody's on the sewer system. So only the people that are on the sewer system are paying sewer rates and therefore paying into the money that's going into the sewer reserve. So to tax somebody, to take money out of a fund that's been funded through taxation, like roads, for instance, and then transfer it to sewer, you're now taking a benefit from somebody who paid property taxes and putting it on towards somebody who's paid sewer rates. They're very different pots of money.
But are there some that are universal? I mean, that's just specific, right? I mean, that's water and sewer that are specific to whoever utilizes them. But are there some non-specific ones that we could transfer?
In the general fund, there are. We're not right in the moment. We're talking about the water fund. So I was sorry. I thought that's what you're referring to.
Yeah, and so it's not as cut and dried. So water, we need to be dipping into the water fund and can only borrow for that. And then unless it's a general fund, general taxation, we can't move that money around to other reserves, correct?
Not to the water or sewer reserves, no. But we could move from, say, general capital to roads or vice versa if council so wanted to do.
Okay, so I'm going to get back to the motion on the table about the annual water rate increase. So basically, if we wanted to, we need this increase to kind of help us with our capital projects and make sure that we have money for that. That's what we're talking about, correct?
That is correct.
If we borrow this, or if we set up this increase here, we still have the ability to borrow money from a bank or wherever to fund projects, and then this money would go into reserves. Can we use that money to pay down the money that we're borrowing? Is it going to be cheaper to borrow the money? I guess that's what I'm saying in the long run.
Your Worship, it's definitely cheap right now to borrow money. It's just a matter of how much debt does the city want to take on, because of course, obviously, if you're borrowing now, you're encumbering for future projects, especially if you've got larger projects such as potentially new arenas and things like that. So that can hinder you a little bit. You could borrow the money and then stick it straight into reserves for future. So now you're paying interest on the money, but you're not having to raise the rates as much. You only have to raise them enough to cover the debt payments. I haven't seen it done that way before. It's usually when you're borrowing, it's for a specific capital project. So we would have to identify that we're borrowing for, rehabilitation and renewal work in specific, which is a specific capital line, because long-term borrowing is done for capital projects. So.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
So just to add more, the advantage of borrowing at this point is that the dollars you borrow today, or say you borrow $100 today, its only value, its value is $90 in the future. But if you put $100 in today, you've lost the $10. If you borrow it, you're gaining, because we have to pay it back, we have to pay back less. So there's some certain advantages to borrowing when inflation is happening. And that's what I want to make sure that we're incorporating into our financial strategy.
Okay. Any other comments, Councilor Palmer?
Thank you, Mayor Sulz. Focusing on the water fund, I don't see a need. Understanding where Councilor Elliott's coming from, but I just don't see that in the water fund. Couple questions. So as the motion that's on the table through to the finance director, with this 10%, I just want to make sure I'm understanding correctly. So the motion on the table would be a 10% water rate increase for 2022, and then in the financial plan, it would be a further 5% in 2023. Is that correct?
That's how I understood the motion, yes.
And then, so basically on the scenarios that you've provided, it would be a blend of your second line and your third scenario, or first and second scenarios. It'd be a blend, so that would come back to us in that case. And then just for clarity, so based on for 2022, you're showing in the scenarios that 10% a deficit of 200,000 coming from reserves. I'm just making sure that that's correct. So that's what you would, so we would actually be pulling out of reserves. And maybe that's further to Councillor Elliott's point. Maybe that's what he's asking to borrow is 200,000 instead of having that. But we would have to attach that to specific projects if we were to do that.
That is correct.
And then, so then in 2023, when that number gets adjusted, it would be a smaller surplus.
That's correct. It would actually be a surplus of about 173,000.
Right, okay. Good. That's all the questions I have for now.
Okay. Any other questions or comments regarding the motion on the table? Okay, so do you,
No, that's okay.
you sure?
Yeah.
Okay. Do you have any more comments regarding this? You want me to call a question? You want to continue?
So when we release it to the public, are we saying 10% to the next 15 years, just for the 2022?
And then 5%.
Follow.
Yeah.
Cumulative. Yeah.
Any comment, Ms. McCabe? We're correct on that?
That's the way I understood it, yes.
Okay, all right. That's fine.
Yeah, and then just for clarity, as you know, budget cycle will go through next year. The new council will be making those decisions. No doubt they're going to be readdressing this again. So that 5%, even though that's the financial plan, it's subject to their discretion at that point.
Correct.
So maybe just a further point. So probably the biggest concern is, from my perspective, through to, well, just to council, is what is our capital plan? And I think that really needs to be looked at, a harder look at for 2023. Where are we really going for the next 5 years? Because we've kind of been sort of skirting around with, trying to figure out where we're going with taxation and fee increases this year. And that's the missing piece for me, is a more robust discussion on the 5-year capital plan. Even though it's kind of in here, I just don't, from my perspective, don't feel that we've had a thorough enough discussion.
We discussed everything to the nth degree, right? Yeah. Councilor Schulman.
Thank you, Richard. Yeah, I empathize. I think we've talked around some capital plans from so many different angles with the various master plans, with the OCP process going through. And the next big one is going to be the DCCs coming back for a major update and really looking at those capital projects and what is due to the natural or the existing taxpayers versus what's due to growth. I think that conversation, while possibly overdue, it will come hopefully, and have that more fulsome discussion that you're talking about around those capital projects and getting an understanding of what do we need to save, what can we put onto debt, what are we comfortable putting onto debt, which we talked about at the last meeting, where the previous council was making a concerted effort to move the city away from borrowing and towards reserve funding. But I don't disagree with Councillor Elliott that looking at borrowing as an evil thing to never touch, I don't think is realistic either. So hopefully the next council will come in and have a fulsome discussion around this capital plan and looking at where does that borrowing fit into that mix.
Yeah, I don't disagree with many of you when it comes to borrowing. And I think we went this way of reserves because previous council had borrowed money for roads, and it just took forever to pay it off. And that's kind of the scenario we're up against with a lot of things. Is that not correct, Ms. McCabe?
That's
Yeah.
correct.
So,
Yeah, I'm comfortable with.
okay, so you're right. I think we need to have some wholesome discussions on down the road. It's going to be probably for the next council more so regarding capital projects. Which projects are going to get done? Which ones are going to be able to move forward? So having said that, we have a motion on the table for 5% for down the road for 5-year plan and then 10% for this year. So Councillor Palmer, any comment?
Yeah, so the table, so the 10%, I'm just focusing on the 10% for 2022 that's proposed in the motion. And the part that I don't like is, well, there's a couple parts I don't like. One, I don't like the increase without a more wholesome understanding of capital plans.
Right.
The other thing I don't like is dipping into reserves, which is kind of like the total opposite. So that's kind of what I'm struggling with. So question to the Director of Finance. So in the Water Capital Fund, there's just a few projects in there. So we had this discussion before, but those projects, which the total capital projects for 2022 is 1.5 million.
Yep.
And of all those projects, I don't know if we have the Director of Engineering here, but are we going to get those projects done in 2022? And I think I've asked that question. It's probably a recurring theme. So are we going to get those projects done in 2022?
Mr. Black's here, so let's let him respond. Thank you, Council.
We will make every effort to achieve the projects that are outlined in the financial plan. Of course, the big consideration right now is getting the funding so that we're certain that once we start down the design path and tendering process, that money is there. And so the longer it takes us to get the budget approved and the money free for our use to get these projects completed, that further delays projects. I'm also aware that, as council should be aware, that we're seeing, because of oil prices, that plastic, asphalt, and those sorts of hydrocarbon-based materials are all up about 20% this year. And so I'm hopeful that we're going to reach a plateau in that cost. However, again, these are costs out of our control.
Is there an advantage?
Go ahead.
Is there an advantage to make a commitment now instead of because things are happening so dramatically, so fast, and the way we can make that commitment to now is saying we'll borrow.
Any comment on that, Mr. Black?
Through your worship, I cannot provide any further guidance on that subject. The finance director, I'm certain, has the proper words to be placed there.
Okay, thanks for avoiding that. And Ms. McKay, follow up on that, then I'm going to go back to Councillor Palmer. With the project, so we have 1.555 million. Do we borrow to make sure those projects do get done? And then, as Councillor Palmer asked, if we borrow, if we have the funding, whether it's through reserves or whatever, are those projects going to get done? So Ms. McKay will go to you, and then I'll go back to Councillor Palmer.
Through your worship, if the intention of borrowing is to ensure that the funds are actually there to use to commit to spending, the challenge with that is that we actually, for all long-term borrowing, we have to go through an alternate approval process. And so the risk of saying we're going to fund it through borrowing and then have Mr. Black go out and commit the money to be spent, and then have people say, no, we don't support borrowing, because that's the risk of that process. It may or may not happen. Then you're stuck having to fund the spending out of reserves, which is the reason for wanting to have sufficient reserves to at least cover a year or 2 years worth of capital projects, preferably more. And we're kind of at a point, as Councillor Palmer pointed out, where the money going into the reserves this year is less than what we're actually budgeting, what's in the budget to be taken out at this point. Though we're going in with about 3 million. So could we borrow for it? Yes, we wouldn't actually have guaranteed borrowed funds until approved to borrow until, later this year. And so if Mr. Black's committing to it, we would be spending it out of reserves. Because that's where we'd have to pull the money from in the short term if we don't get the borrowing.
Okay, good, and that's what you actually spoke to earlier. Thanks for that. Councillor Palmer.
Thank you. Mayor Sulz, thank you. So ideally, I'd like to see it balanced, but, we're kind of not splitting hairs. It's an important figure. To me, the borrowing question is just not relevant for 2022 because there's, and so I think that I will support this motion. I think we need to move on. I'm really sort of struggling with that a little bit. I look forward to a more wholesome discussion. Again, before the new councils comes in, I'd like to see a little bit more wholesome discussion on water capital and sewer capital and capital in general. So I look forward to that in the fall.
And I think we're all in the same boat, kind of struggling with that in this little conversation. Any other comments on the motion on the floor?
So, and just for clarity, the utilities are not being separated from our tax bill this year.
That's correct.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
All right, all those in favor? Opposed? Motion's carried. Thank you. Thank you, Councillor Rind. I did see you. All right, item 2. Someone want to put that on the table? Any thoughts about that? First, regarding percentages, or do you want to have a conversation?
I look forward to hearing a motion.
He's looking directly at you, Councillor.
I'll put a motion on the table. It's not exact. That the long-term financial plan reflects scenario 4, the package.
Okay, so that's a 30% annual increase each year for 3 years, 2022 to 2024, then reduces an increase of 3 years in subsequent years. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, so Ms. McKay, just in reading that, basically we're looking at, so 30% 2022, and 3% or 30% in 23, 24, and then so for 2022 we're increasing that by 30%, and then subsequent years 33% after, right?
That's correct.
Okay, so yep, someone want to stop? Councillor Charlotte. Okay, comments on the motion. So when I look at the motion, sorry, Councillor, look at the motion with 30% 2022, 30% thereafter for those 3 years that we talked about, 2022, 2023, 2024, and staff prepare a bylaw to amend fees and charges 2256 to increase sewer rates by 30% for 2022. So that's kind of where we're at, correct? Councillor, okay. Councillor Charlotte, comment.
I'm curious as to whether staff could provide a guide or any insight on whether in the long-term future, these fees would be able to come back down again once the fees or the debt has been paid for the sewer treatment plant. Like what length of time are we talking about these higher sewer fees?
So we're talking right now with this motion, we're just talking for 3 years.
Yeah.
Right? And then subsequent at 3%. But so in answer to Councillor Charlotte's question, Ms. McCabe, is there going to be, are we being realistic about this moving forward as far as rates per year? over, a period of time.
I wish I had a crystal ball. This is based on the best information that we have at this time, based on past historical operating costs, and then obviously the assessment that Mr. Black has had done of the sewer system to determine the cost going forward as far as capital maintenance that's required. So I think in this one we do have a little bit more certainty because we have that study has been completed, and so that was why I provided an increase that's a little bit higher in the initial years, but then lower later on, so that a 3% increase into the future would seem on par with inflation or CPI, and so that's why that was used. Does that answer the question, though?
No,
Sort of. We were talking at the last meeting around comparing sewer and water fees for various other communities, and we're talking about how it's very difficult to compare because everyone's in different stages of investing in their infrastructure, upgrading their infrastructure, or paying off the debt to do so.
right.
So what I'm seeing here is some major upgrades and very clearly laid out capital plans in the sewer treatment plant, in the sewer capital fund. And then after that, it should be maintenance for a while and paying off that debt. I guess I'm just trying to wrap my brain around the fact that our sewer fees will be this high for the foreseeable future because we haven't been investing for enough in the past years. So it's almost not quite indefinite, I suppose. It's hard to see and rub that crystal ball, but I just keep thinking about how we just finished paying off some debt in the other utility, in the water, if I remember correctly, where it was just adjusting for that, but then we need to invest in the next batch. So is that timing going to work out with this one as well, where we're going to be investing in new, but there just seems like we've left it so long. So as we replace all these older pipes that are over 100 years old, hopefully we can get to a point where it's...
We are definitely playing catch up. The sewer rates have been quite a bit lower for many, many years. And so unfortunately, at some point, I think the saying goes, you have to pay the piper at some point. And so, yes, and because those rates have been kept low, now we need to increase them to compensate. So, yeah, I wish we'd collected the revenue in the past. Historically, sewer rates up until about 5 years ago were increased 2% per year, which was basically just covering the increase in operating expenses each year.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Any comment, Mr. Black?
I would suggest that, yes, we're in a painful place. As we update our programs and understand more fulsome the system as a whole, the opportunity to consider that we've reached an apex and we're now seeing an increase in the overall system integrity. That I think is the point that you're looking for, and we are looking for as staff to know that we've got a system that is wholesome, fulsome, and operating at a level of service that is as we would expect as a community and as a resort. And so part of that establishing that level is going to be this asset management plan that we brought to council a couple of weeks ago to establish what are those levels. And so once that is established, then staff will be obligated to return to council on an annual or semi or biannual basis to report on these things so that council then has a better handle on where we're going and how those fees relate to the infrastructure itself. And I think that's where we need to go in the long term so that the community also is completely aware of what we're doing and why. And I think that's maybe part of the missing link here in the past is that it's out of sight, out of mind, and so now we're going, oh, well, now we know that we, as Director McCabe stated, we're paying the piper. So
fair enough. Thank you very much for that, through Chair. I appreciate the clarity that we're starting to get on this bigger picture of what is the reality of what we're seeing. And I appreciate all the photos and the videos and the reports that have already come to council and that are still to come that I've been hearing about. So thank you very much for your efforts on this. And I look forward to seeing that conversation, because I think as we get more clarity around what we are aiming for, I think that we will be able to get more understanding and buy-in from the community as we have to make these decisions.
And clarity is absolutely paramount. We need to be transparent so that the community knows what we're up against, why we're here, and how we move forward. And I think that's really the key. So, Ms. McCabe, I know that you've got your accountant hat on, so I'm going to ask the same question I asked with water. What are we looking at for our ratepayers for this increase of 30%? How much is that per year for the homeowner?
It'd be $449 per year.
449?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And so they're looking at 449. This year it's going to be 30% again, and that's not going to be 449 for next year, correct?
No, it'll be at 30. Another 30% would bump it up to 584.
Okay. All right. Good. All right. Thank you for that. Any other comments from councilors? Councilor? Yep. Councilor Plummer, then I'll come back to you.
Thank you. Just through to Tanya on the deficit. So with that scenario, it's showing a deficit increasing each of the next 3 years. Of course, we have a major project that's integrated in that, which compared to the earlier version, that's been, staff have stretched that out over those years for the water treatment plant upgrade, which is a pretty big project. Do these numbers in this scenario reflect the borrowing in 2023, 2024, or 2025 at this point? Or so I'm looking at that deficit from the reserve. So in your original scenario presented some time ago, I think in February, it showed debt of a little over $6 million for the water treatment plant. Is that still there, except for in subsequent years?
Yes, I've smoothed it out over the 2 years. So it's 4.6 million that we're projecting we're going to have to borrow. The actual cost of borrowing that would come into the operating plan in 2024 and 2025. So it would be reflected in that net deficit or surplus or deficit position in those years. And that's why it's growing a bit, because of the debt costs.
Right. And then in that, with that scenario, with that borrowings, so that we would be going out to alternate approval process or whatever. What would be the timing? And maybe that's more of a question will be between you and Mr. Black, but as to what would be the timing we would need to be going out? Are projects at a point now where we could start to have that discussion?
Yes, definitely. I think that would be something the borrowing bylaw is at third reading, which is what's required for the grant application that was put forward for that project. And so the borrowing bylaw has been sitting there at that third reading. We'll go back and we'll review the amount of the borrowing bylaw to make sure that it's sufficient. I believe we might have amended it a couple of times since then. And so we'll go back, we'll double check where it's at, and then we will start the alternate approval process for that money so that we can actually adopt the bylaw. Once the bylaw is adopted, it means that then I can go and borrow either temporary borrowing or long-term borrowing through the next debt issue from MFA. So I could go out and borrow when that's done.
And then through the chair, are we waiting for that, the completion of that bylaw contingent on receiving the grant?
It was, yes.
Okay. And so that timing is probably political. So we don't really know. So that might happen this summer.
It could.
More likely going to be in the fall, like after the election just guessing and maybe.
Yeah, it's possible because there's an election coming up. It's possible we could roll it into that process as well too. Staff will review that and see which is the most cost-effective way of doing it.
Right. So anyway, I think Councillor Elliott. Councillor Elliott.
So I understand this is a $500 increase to taxes this year. Is that
No,
what I just mentioned, or?
580 for next year, so $449 for the
This
sewer
year.
fee this year.
It's going up.
$104.
Is the increase, so we're looking at $449 for.
That's what I was getting at.
it's going up $8.67 per month for 2022.
The way it was conveyed, it was $500 for the increase for the year. I'm all for the discussion we're having, but we're agreeing on a lump sum at this stage when we haven't, basically we should be presented with all, before we set it in stone, we should know what the entire picture, we're not really budgeting unless we're balancing, we're juggling all these things to make it palatable. If you commit to this and then we commit to something else, as long as we can have that discussion, we're gonna cut back somewhere else. So just that would be budgeting. If we're just agreeing on a price now and then going to the next topic, we're divisive in our approach to it. And it's hard to make a sane, palatable decision for our community overall. So I just want to let that be known.
Yeah, that makes sense. So we're talking about fees and charges, even though they're going to show up on the tax form this year, we're talking about utility fees, right? And so it's still going to make, whatever we come up with, the staff provide to us for a percentage of taxation increase, this is still going to be on those tax forms as they're sent out. So you're right, people are going to look at that and see. So we're committing to $104 over last year for water and sewer, and whatever we were, 50 or 60 bucks for water. And that's, so that's why I wanted to know what the total is, right? And so, and then, yep, we're looking at it separately, and then we're gonna look at it together as to what that's gonna be based on. And so when we talk about the overall tax fees, there's gonna be, there's gonna be school taxes, there's gonna be hospital taxes, there's gonna be all of those things all included on that one form. And people are gonna go like, whoa, our taxes have really gone up. So we need to be clear about what the fees are. And it is gonna, it's gonna affect all of us. Yeah. All right, any other comment on the motion? No, on the table, Councilor Palmer.
Thank you, Mayor Sulz. I'm gonna repeat it just from my understanding and I guess for people that might be listening. So if the director can correct me if I'm wrong. So if Councillor Elliott's concerned about what it looks like on the tax bill, people get a tax bill, they open it up, it comes through and there's a number on the bottom and they have a heart attack because it's gone up a whole bunch.
Yep.
So that's this sort of balancing what's the tolerance. So I think that's a really relevant point.
Of course.
When it comes down to our budgeting, we have to do sewer. We can't rob from other areas. So right now we're talking about the motion on the table is on sewer, which is a fee. It's not taxation.
Yeah.
It's a fee. And for most people, it's one of the same, but we are legislatively required to look at this very separately, distinctly, and we can't rob from other areas. So that's one of the challenges that we have as council, because we can't do that big picture budgeting process.
Yeah.
So what's being presented is $104 and change increase for the typical homeowner for sewer only. There'll be an increase for water. There'll be an increase in taxation probably, but just for the sewer of being able to flush your toilet and have the water
go away.
We're going to pay an extra $100 this year compared to last year. Why? We've gone through a liquid waste management plan, a really robust process, and thank you to Stephen Black and his people for looking at that. we need to upgrade our wastewater facilities, and we've done a lot of work in that. And that was also we were very tardy in getting that done, but that is one of the successes that this council staff has had, is getting that liquid waste management plan complete. So, but what comes with that is a legislative requirement from the province. That liquid waste management plan says, okay, Revelstoke, you have to do these things, which is this big project, which there's a proposal to borrow. I think that's important for me and the decision making. I'm supportive. I hate the idea of a 30% increase to $100, but it's something that is a genuine catch up, and it's gone through a public process already. And so I can be supportive of that. The question of the borrowing, which I think is relevant to Councillor Elliott's concerns, that this is a place that we need to, and staff has already identified, to borrow. This is very appropriate, and maybe we need to get on this as soon as possible because of rates. I think that's my main points. Again, looking at subsequent years, because of that capital project, originally that was being proposed entirely in 2022, and that increase would have been just absolutely astronomical. But it's that capital has been rolled back from the original proposal of almost $18 million to
1.45.
Thank you. So this year, so that, that's been pulled back and is more responsible over the years. I am concerned about the ongoing deficit, and I think that's of 2023 and 2024, because we're pulling down the reserves quite a bit. So there's that balance. And I agree very much with Councillor Elliott about making sure we borrow appropriately. And yet we don't want to dry up our reserves. And I see that trend, even with these big increases, there is that trend, which gets back to Councillor Charlotte. Your comments sounded very conservative, small c conservative. Will we ever be able to stop taxation from increasing? That's what conservatives want. So thank you for that. And I think when we look at that deficit, there really realistically is we're going to keep on growing. But that does come back to the importance of our DCCs, getting our DCCs in a really good sound condition. The master plans, which Director Black has put together, is going to really help on that work.
Yes.
And that needs to be a priority for the next council. Long ramble, but I think that's just a summary, so I got it clear in my mind. I will vote in support of this motion.
Okay. Councillor Schropp, did you have anything? Councillor Schropp?
Maybe one more question. Once we get the DCCs set in place, is the objective to apply those funds against the deficits or reserves that or the funding of the projects? Ultimately, the DCCs are not adequate to support the infrastructure that we require at this time. We're amending the DCCs to accommodate in the future. If we run into a deficit, if we run into our reserves or run on the downside, will the DCCs, are they intended to be applied against that shortfall?
Any comment on that, Ms. McCabe and Mr. Black? So when we're talking about, well, I'm just going to let you answer the question.
Sorry.
No, that's okay.
Through your worship, DCCs, the DCC bylaw specifies specific projects and identifies the cost for those projects at the time the bylaw is amended or adopted with them in it. And then going forward, the city can then collect funds from future development that it puts aside and is earmarked for those specific projects. So we can't use DCCs to fund potential deficits in the sewer fund as a whole. It can only be used to fund the specific projects that are identified in the DCC bylaw. So there, in this particular capital plan, there are a couple of projects that have been identified as being partially growth related. And so the budget has been changed to fund a portion of those projects from development costs. And so then we would need to amend the bylaw to make sure those projects are actually included in the bylaw at the appropriate cost so that we can collect the fees to fund those particular capital projects.
There's my for you, Councillor.
So basically, the DCCs, the conversation, we're not going to alleviate the shortfall on the, or the expense of the capital expenditure.
No.
Councillor Plum?
Thank you, Mayor. So further to Councillor Elliott's questions, on the sewer capital fund as presented in February, you had source of funds, so you had reserve, debt, and grants. DCCs were not shown on that. How much money do we have in sewer DCCs?
Oh, you would ask me that question. Give me a minute and I'll pull it up. I just had it open. At the end of 2021, we had about 1.35 million in sewer DCCs. And those are specified to different specific projects, obviously.
Right. And then with the wastewater treatment plant, so that project, which again is stretched over the next few years, is that currently a DCC project or not? Correct. So it's not a DCC project, and is it correct that the reason it's not a DCC project is we just finished the liquid waste management plan? It wasn't done in time for, if we even had done a fulsome DCC review, but we only did an inflationary increase, so it's not included.
That's correct. And I will clarify, in the current DCC bylaw, there is collections for a sewer treatment plant, but it's actually for the last upgrade that we borrowed for, and so we're still collecting DCCs to pay back that debt.
Oh, interesting. And then, so just further to that, so when the next council that is going to be laser focused on the DCCs of actually getting that done in 2023, in the first 6 months, can the wastewater treatment plant at that point, the part that hasn't been committed to, be included in that DCCs?
Future ones can be, yes. I don't believe the one that's currently we have the grant for that's in the budget, that one cannot be added to it.
Right, okay. So that's, in hindsight, is lost opportunity. Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Any other comments on the motion on the table? So we're looking at 30% 2022, 30% thereafter for the next 2 years, and then preparing a bylaw to amend the fees and charges 2256 for 30% for 2022. So I'll call a question. All those in favor? Opposed? Motion's carried. Thank you. All right, we're going to go into the portion talk about communications budget implication regarding the communications position. So, Councillor Brulette, we're discussing this, and you wanted to bring this up at council. So, I'll let you start.
Thank you, Your Worship. I recognize Councillor Elliott has a good point. There are quite a few adjustments to our budget as a full picture, looking at the overall tax increase and the impact on our ratepayers, whether it's fees or taxes. At the end of the day, they do get that one bill. And I can understand the concern and the desire to budget as you would in home or in a business. I'm concerned about our communications capacity in City Hall. From what I understand, the contract that we had approved back in 2019, I believe it was a part-time role for communications that has since been ended because it was not serving the need that it was supposed to serve.
Right.
From what I understand, and I would love to hear more on where we're currently at with the communications role, because I know that the previous contractor is helping with the upcoming budget communications.
Okay, so Ms. McCabe, do you want to weigh in, or Ms. Floyd? Just carry on the conversation for a couple minutes. I'm just going to have to go back here.
You're correct. There is a budget for a part-time communications person as a contractor in the budget. It was added in 2020. It was about $25,000. It was added into the budget that year to cover the cost of a communications person. And yes, so that budget is still physical. The budget for the project or the work is still in the plan. It hasn't been removed. However, the person that was doing the work, the contract has expired. And so now it's a matter of how do we move forward with that. Internally within my own within the finance department, I am working with her to help with some of the communications that come out of finance, particularly using the contracted services budget that I have. It's not a huge budget, but it's enough to cover this kind of stuff. But yes, there's definitely a need for a full-time communications person. That becomes more and more clear as time goes on. I'm not sure if Cindy wants to add anything to that or not.
I think you covered it quite well, Ms. McCabe. We found that the communications, it was difficult using a contracted person because they weren't in City Hall. They didn't have their hands on the pulse to know what was going on and to be able to react immediately. So that was still happening on the sides of corporate services desks. So it wasn't that we were not pleased with the coordinator's work because it was fantastic. It was the problem was that if we needed something immediately, it was very difficult to address. And so I brought this forward to Ms. McCabe and to the CAO that I thought we needed a full-time in-house person. Prior to budget discussions, it didn't quite make it on the table. So that's why the contract was not renewed, because it was at least for a year. And I thought that this discussion might have an impact on going forward.
Right. So do we still have that 25,000 budgeted for 2022 for part-time that has not been used then so far? So
No.
If we were to look at an additional 25,000 to fund that to a full-time position, what are the odds of that being able to move forward in this year?
I would suggest first that we'd actually need to add more than that to it to make it a full-time position. Probably adding 50,000 to it would be more reasonable. And that would potentially add, it could potentially add another, obviously that increase onto the budget. Staff could also look at other ways of potentially funding that money, that additional budget expense.
Councillor Elliott?
Just at the start of our term, we had a consultant come in and evaluate or create a communication strategy.
Right.
Where is that document? What were the recommendations from it? So I never saw it. I'm not sure where it landed.
Ms. Floyd, any comments? Do we know
I can kind of speak to that. That was just as I was getting into this position, but I know that COVID threw a wrench into things. So the communications strategy was not presented to council. It has since, it's a little bit old now, so it's not relevant or as relevant as it was. And most of the recommendations were things that we were already doing. But in my opinion, it solidified the need for a full-time in-house person.
And I think that was what culminated, well, it was the feeling I had, we were going to come back with a proposal, just move ahead with this communication, because I think we identified that it was important and needed in the way we move, the way we operate. And somehow it ended up as a temporary position or part-time, and it just wasn't anywhere what I expected, and it just sort of morphed into something I'm not sure it was a real purpose. And I'm saying, how do we get there? What? Because it's totally off track from the recommendations that we gave to this Barb Flo, I think was her name, but it was just seemed to be off track. And I'm just wondering if we need to bring it back, say what were the recommendations and what can we implement?
So, yeah, I'll go to Councillor Charlotte and then I'll wait.
Well, from what I'm understanding is that the recommendations were before the pandemic, right before the pandemic, and when the pandemic hit and we had several staffing changes, it's just fallen off the rails. And so communications has been keeping up as best it can through administration, but it has not made it back to the table to have this conversation. So while I recognize it did not make it into the table earlier in the budget conversations, and that a 50,000 increase is going to have an impact on that overall budget line, I personally believe that it is important enough, especially this year, to have those resources available for our corporate administration and the City Hall in general, so that the community hears clearly what we're working on. And as we go into these major projects and OCP wraps up, the levels of service conversation, the opportunity to communicate that effectively, both internally and externally, I think is too big of a need to overlook.
Councilor Bergson.
Personally, I think 25,000 more probably is enough, given that we'd be unlikely to hire someone before June. So basically, the budget would only have to cover half a year salary. So 50,000 to me seems reasonable for half a year. That's my feeling. Just
To follow up on that, then could we do 25,000 for 2022 and 25,000 for 2023? Because then next year it will be a full-time position. This year it might not. So to your point, fair that I'm willing, happy to hear back from staff on what they think about that proposal, just to split it off a little bit, but to have it already in the budget for conversation.
Ms. Floyd.
So just to remind you, we have used some of the budget money, the consulting budget money to date for certain projects. We also do have her committed to doing communications for the annual report that's due at the end of June.
Okay.
So I can't say that we haven't used for sure the full amount that's in that contracted services budget, but we have used a portion of it.
okay, that makes more sense then.
Okay, so just because I was out of the room, I want to just go back. Is there, do we have funds somewhere that we can fund some of this without taxation increase, Ms. McCabe?
I can certainly have a look at that and then work that into the final budget that's brought forward to council next.
Okay.
Yeah,
Councilor,
I know we're doing a bit of a service level review and the communications is obviously identified, but I think equal to that was an environmental warrior or someone on the continuous sustainability front. We have lost our, with Penny Britton moving on, and we haven't really had we had a short-term.
Caitlin was there.
Yeah, Caitlin was here for short-term, but really no voice to council on the matter. And the world is changing, and we need to be current, and we need to stay, if sustainable is in our vision statement, we should be living up to it. And we haven't put anyone in place or anyone even accountable to it.
and I think with Caitlin's position, that was grant funded, was it not? Yeah.
So I that to me is a big miss, and especially if we want to live where we want to live. We need that input into our decisions.
And so we're going to start to see some of the organizational review reports come in, sometime in the near future, I believe. So I'll be communicating with those people and see where we're at with that. So Ms. McCabe, I guess, my feeling is if there's a way that we can find some money in what we already have without going to an increase. Communications, I fully agree. We need something full time. But can you just kind of report back to us as to where can we find some money? We can take it out of something else or reserves for toilet paper or something. That sort of thing, and just see if there's a way that we can do that, and then we can continue this conversation. I think it's important to have this. And go from there. All right. Councilor Palmer.
Thank you, Mayor. So interesting conversation. We've alluded to this organizational review, which has come up other times. I don't think we've ever really officially released any of the in-camera information. Maybe that's something we should be looking at, and that's a communications thing in itself.
Perfect. Yeah, thank you for that.
And because I think the conversation we're having here, I think is quite appropriate. And so in context of organizational review, I'm wondering what the budget implications and with the absence of a CAO right now, a full-time CAO or a committed CAO, is, when does that organizational review, what's the financial impacts coming, either positive or negative?
Right.
And then how does this piece, like I couldn't say categorically that we should have a full-time communications officer in the absence of having that. So I think that's maybe a question that perhaps you can bring back at the next meeting as to, well, where are we at, and then what help do we need to get that through, and how does that tie into financial impacts for 2022 and 2023?
All right, that's good, that sounds fair. Councillor Charlotte.
Thanks, and yeah, one final comment on that as well. If we are looking at a full-time communications role, our communications strategy was created, just not presented to council, because I was under the impression we hadn't gotten that far. From the sounds of it, perhaps it just needs a revamp for post-COVID realities and our new technology that we have available to us in City Hall that at the time we didn't have. So at least getting that updated so that the full-time role has clarity in what that looks like, because to me that was already pointed out and decided on prior to this organizational review, that to me would only suggest more additional finances or resources rather than less. So getting a communication strategy that's updated and back and relevant for current times, and having those resources in place as we go through the search for our new CAO, as we go into an election season, as we go into all these things this year, having those resources are going to be critical. In my opinion.
The consultant came in to give us a plan for a communications role.
Yeah.
We never saw it. So that to me is something wrong, some disconnect. We didn't get any recommendation. If the report was finalized, it should have come to us. And that's the mix. And I'm wondering how it got lost. And that should be, or we have it, let's get it to us. And we can decide what's relevant, what needs to be changed. But it shouldn't be just we paid the money and it disappears, it was squandered. So it seems to me like a shame that happened.
And so we'll have a look, we'll see what we can find. So Ms. McCabe, you have your hand.
Actually, no, it's about something different. So once you're finished with the communications conversation, but I will say that the report wasn't, that COVID kind of did derail a lot of things in the city, and this is another example of something that definitely got derailed. The intention was to bring it back. It was built into the budget in 2020, at least the beginning of it was anyways, and it wasn't the intent of staff to bring that back. However, COVID did sidetrack a lot of things, and this is another example of something that got sidetracked. And unfortunately, before COVID was over, we'd switched out we'd had some staffing changes that also unfortunately derailed it. So it's unfortunate, it has happened, but staff will definitely work on bringing that back.
And that's what we'll look at that and then bring it back to council. We can have that conversation. And as you're saying, what's relevant, what's not, how do we work it in? Okay.
But I have something else to ask.
Okay.
I have another request.
Go ahead.
I realized that as part of the resolutions, I possibly should have had one on there regarding the actual tax increase, the general tax increase and the changes. So the budget review document identifies a number of different changes to the budget, the general operating budget I'm now talking about. And so it would be good if I can get some indication if council is in support of these changes to be brought forward in the draft document to the public. And if that's the case, then I will build them in. They're built in. I will continue on with these changes. That's the reason for that document. Basically, it effectively is the net effect is a 2.5% general operating tax increase, and then it's a continuation of the 2% increase tax increase that goes towards transportation infrastructure.
Right. So you're asking for us to put a motion on to build that into a document to come back to council to discuss? Is that what you're looking for?
What we'll be doing is the next stage will be actually the long-term financial plan, the draft one, and the guide that would be going out to the public for discussion. And so we've had the conversation about these different changes at previous meetings. It would just be good to finalize that and get confirmation from, because there has been some changes since then. And just to make sure that everyone's on the same page and understands that this is what will be part of the draft budget that will be going out to the public.
Okay, Councillor Schumer.
I can make that motion that the total revenue that the long-term financial plan be prepared to reflect a 2.5% operational tax increase and a 2% increase for transfer to the Transportation Infrastructure Reserve. Is that correct? Is that what you're looking for?
Thank you.
Seconder for that motion. Councillor Elliott. Any further discussion on that motion? So basically, you're looking, I'm going to ask this question kind of in broad terms, Ms. McCabe. You're looking forward to something, this would bring a document to council, we would look at it, and then it would go to the public after. Is that correct?
That is correct. We've been through the general fund and the different utilities. We've talked about, there's been changes made, obviously, based on the conversation that's been had. And so the next step is the actual budget that will go out to the public in its draft form for public feedback.
Okay, so my question is, it's going to come back to council first before we're going out to the community?
Always.
Okay. All right. Any further comments or questions from council?
Just,
Go ahead.
Kim mentioned this service level review, and
Right.
So this is not going to be in effect for this term, this budget. We're looking for the following years, right? The service level is kind of an overview of the entire operation and say, what do we need, boil it down to essentials, and we'll make it. So we're looking at that to the public. We want to make sure that we're good stewards of the entity here. So that is being undertaken. So I just want to make sure that the public is aware of it.
And so we'll talk, I'll have a conversation with staff and then talk about in camera and then out of camera and that sort of thing. Right.
Okay.
And then and go forward with that. Because I think Councilor Palmer brought up a great point. Anyway, so the motion on the table basically is 2% to 0.5% to come back to council. We'll have that discussion. And then at that point, we can make some decisions on general rates, and then it can go out to the community. You guys okay with that?
Sorry.
Okay, get to the point. Yeah.
If you would rather, because I'm trying to think about the best way to do this and keep on the timelines, because obviously time is getting shorter. And so the next meeting, the intention would be for that what's presented to council to actually be what goes out to the public without changes at that point. And then we would get public consultation and feedback. And then from that feedback, if council wants to make any additional changes based on the feedback, then we would build that into the final long-term financial plan.
Okay, good. All right, that makes sense. All right. Any comments from council? Seeing none, I'll call the question. All those in favor? Opposed? Note that Councilor Palmer is opposed. Balance of council in favor. All right, so we'll have that come to the next council meeting. That's it. I'm going to ask for termination of the meeting. Councilor Charlotte, seconded by Councilor Brooks Hill. All in favor? Motion's carried. Thank you. Appreciate your time.